welcome to another episode of the Caroline Glick Show. A lot going on in the region and in Israel these days, and I want to start with the biggest regional development in recent days, which is the conclusion in Beijing on Friday of a normalization agreement between Iran and Saudi Arabia under the aegis of the People's Republic of China. Iran and Saudi Arabia have agreed to restore their diplomatic relations for the first time since 2016. And this is a big deal. This is a big deal first and foremost for the United States, because what it shows more than anything else is that spurned U.S. allies like Saudi Arabia are looking for and finding other options for superpower allies, in this case, America's chief rival, China. This is a big blow to America's position in the region and a big upgrade for China. That they're doing this. They're already the largest, I think, purchaser of oil certainly from Iran and increasingly from Saudi Arabia. They're using their soft power, their AI technologies and their 5G technologies, which they're industrializing, to bring more and more countries in the Middle East and throughout the world into the Belt and Road Initiative and into China's economic zone. In competition, of course, with the U.S. zone. We've already seen the purchase of oil in yuan and in rubles, which is essentially canceling the petrodollar. The U.S. dollar as the currency for global oil markets is now no longer the king. And this is a big deal, and you would expect for the United States to be really upset about this, but they're not, at least not officially. And by all counts, not at all. The administration and their proxies have all said that they're totally fine with this. They think it's fantastic. Really, the only thing that they care about is the outcome, and they were supportive of a restoration of ties between Saudi Arabia and Iran all along, and they have no problem with the fact that this was mediated by the Chinese. And I think what's notable about this is that I actually believe the Americans. The Biden administration really doesn't care about the rise of China, not at the expense of the United States and not at all. If they did, they would be taking a whole host of actions, which they're not taking both at home and abroad, to try to ward off and surmount the rising challenge that China poses for the United States, both economically and strategically. I mean, for instance, just, off the top of my head, rather than fight Chinese subversion of Americans through academia, through their various initiatives on college campuses, something that the Trump administration worked to shut down, the Biden administration has opened it up. They've closed investigations against U.S. academics that received money and grants from the Department of Defense and also received money and grants from China and didn't report on the money that they were receiving from China. These are steps that you wouldn't take if you were trying to compete with China or tamp down on Chinese power and influence. You would be doing the kinds of things that my colleague and friend David Goldman has been calling for, screaming about for the past decade, which is putting major investments, $1 trillion, not in diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, but in rebuilding and expanding U.S. technological capabilities along the lines of the Strategic Defense Initiative that the Reagan administration carried out in 1983 to defeat the Soviet Union. The United States would be investing that kind of money in research and development of U.S. technologies. Just last week, I think it was, the Wall Street Journal put out a study. They published a study that showed that China is now outpacing the United States, I think in 37 out of 41 technologies and scientific areas, so that the Chinese are now surpassing the United States in science and technology, something that U.S. elites have for generations poo-pooed the possibility of happening. And yet it is happening. It's happening now right in front of our eyes. In the United States, rather than fight this, they're acting like it's no big deal. Again, you wouldn't think that the Americans would act the way that they are, but manufacturing, is the Biden administration doing anything to restore American manufacturing? No, nothing. Are they doing anything like the Trump administration did to enable American energy independence? To the contrary, they're doing everything that they can to block American energy independence, whether it's with natural gas pipelines that they've shut down, or fracking licenses that they're not giving on federal lands, and everything in between. So they're encouraging U.S. energy producers not to produce. They're not encouraging U.S. companies to remove themselves back to the United States from abroad. Nothing. They're not doing anything that you would expect them to do, and so it's not surprising that here, too, the United States is not fighting in any way Chinese encroachment in the Middle East. And then Iran. I mean, this is an agreement that absolutely empowers Iran. Excuse me, I got a bit of a cold this week. Iran wins from this, right? I mean, they've been wanting to be restored to the fold in the Middle East with the Arab states. And here, through the good offices of the Chinese, they are. This is a big bonanza for Iran, and the United States doesn't mind. Why doesn't it mind? I mean, just last week or 10 days ago, the director of the CIA, William Burns, said that Iran is just 12 days away from nuclear breakout, whatever that means, how you cannot be at nuclear breakdown if you're 12 days away, and how the CIA knows how to say precisely 12 days and not 13 or 11. Beyond me, but, you know, I'm not a CIA officer, so maybe I don't have that enlightenment required to understand what that means, 12 days away from nuclear breakout. At any rate, you would think that the United States would be doing everything that they could to try to push the Iranian nuclear genie back in the bottle, since they claim that they're so opposed to Iran acquiring nuclear weapons. But they're not doing anything of the sort. To the contrary, we see that interest, very clear, keen interest that the British and the EU have expressed in applying economic sanctions to the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, to designating the IRGC as a terrorist organization. The United States, the Biden administration, is actually actively working to undermine their efforts to designate the IRGC as a terrorist organization. So the United States is standing by happily, watching, doing nothing as Iran gets more empowered, as it is brought back into the fold of the Middle East, as it expands its strategic alliance with China, with Russia, as it supplies the weapons of war to Russia to maintain its war of attrition against Ukraine, while the United States is not capable today industrially to replenish the stores that it's emptying out by supplying Ukraine in this war. So, you know, the United States is not acting like a superpower that's concerned about either maintaining its position, protecting its allies, preventing its enemies from increasing their power, whether that enemy is the People's Republic of China or the Islamic Republic of Iran. So where does that leave us, right? I mean, it leaves Israel in a perfect storm. Last week, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu went to Rome. This week, he's supposed to be going to Berlin to lobby European leaders to do what they want to do, which is to designate the IRGC as a terrorist organization, among other things, and to end the nuclear diplomacy that they continue to carry out through the EU and that Rob Malley is carrying out through the Iraqi regime and others to try to empower Iran still further through the cancellation of sanctions, even as Iran strides towards the nuclear finish line. So Netanyahu, we've seen that he's trying to fight this diplomatically through his shuttle diplomacy to Europe. He's trying to fight this diplomatically with soft power. Last week, he gave an interview to Iran International. That's the television network that broadcasts into Iran in Farsi. That was forced to leave London, where they were headquartered until just a couple of weeks ago, and moved to Washington at a moment's notice because they were under critical threat from the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, which Britain, again, wants to designate as a terrorist organization. But the U.S., despite the fact that the IRGC is operating in the United States to kill former U.S. officials like Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, National Security Advisor John Bolton, and even former President Trump, the Biden administration is pushing the Europeans not to designate the IRGC as a terrorist organization and impose the sanctions related to such a designation by Europe. So Netanyahu is going to the Iranian people, speaking to them directly in a very important interview that was broadcast into Iran last Thursday night. So he's talking to the Europeans, he's talking to the Iranian people, and He's giving the IDF and Israel's security apparatuses the means, financial and material, they need in order to carry out a military strike against Iran's nuclear installations to, again, push Iran back, to push them back, to prevent them from crossing the nuclear threshold, from becoming a nuclear power. Netanyahu told the interviewer in Iran International, and he said on many occasions that he's only returned to office. He only decided to return to office to take care of the Iranian nuclear threat, and he's absolutely committed to doing that, and I think we can trust him. I know we can trust him on this score. But all of this is happening at a terrible time inside in Israel. I don't think that there's anything here that's just happening by chance. I think we've spoken here on this program and at JNS about the fact that the United States is funding through the State Department one of the central nodes of the revolutionary violence that we're seeing on the part of the left against the government, the Netanyahu government, and against the coalition and against the Knesset. The Movement for Quality Government has been receiving direct support from the U.S. State Department. Every single senior member of the administration, from Biden and Kamala Harris to Secretary of State Blinken, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, last week it was Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of Defense, have all essentially sided with the rioters on the streets of Israel against the Netanyahu government. Saying that the Netanyahu government shouldn't. It's anti-democratic for the democratically elected government of Israel to pass in a lawful way measures in parliament that realign the balance of power by placing minimal limitations on judicial power in Israel. The ambassador here, Tom Nides, has broken every diplomatic convention, essentially, by openly interfering in Israel's domestic affairs, treating the Netanyahu, relating to him as a child, saying, I speak to the Israeli government as I speak to my children, he said in a podcast with David Axelrod, and say, you have to pump on the brakes on this judicial reform, you mustn't pass it. And meeting very openly with leaders of the riots outside in Tel Aviv and throughout the country, acting not as the opposition to the government, but as the resistance, as if the government is an illegal, unlawful, illegitimate occupying power of their country. So the United States is very clearly supporting this. Somebody on the outside, on the inside, in Israel, outside of Israel. We know a lot of outside groups, both in the EU and the American Jewish community through the New Israel Fund, are funding this. They say so openly. And this is not simply a demonstration. This isn't a mass rally of people who are getting up. They're being pushed up. Somebody's directing this. This costs hundreds of millions of dollars. This isn't a joke. This is a huge production. I mean, just every flag that they bring out into their rallies that they're bringing in on rented trains, on rented trucks to Tel Aviv to hand out, each one of those flags costs at least $10. And we're talking about hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of flags that they're buying and distributing at every rally. So, I mean, just that alone is an outlay that, no Likud rally has ever seen. Somebody's paying for this. Somebody is directing it. I don't know who, but there are a lot of people involved, and they're not all in Israel, and I'm not even sure most of them are in Israel. But this is an attack on the Jewish state from inside. And this brings me to, what we talked about last week, which was the pilots from a key, perhaps the most operational squadron in the Israel Air Force, saying that they want to that they're not going to serve in reserves. They're not going to serve in reserves at a time when, as I laid out, the clock is ticking down on Iran, and Israel's going to have to operate now in the next 2 months. I mean, the Saudi-Iranian deal, the one out for Israel is that it only goes into effect in 2 months, so we have 8 weeks to act. Because once we let those 2 months pass without acting, Saudi Arabia may be unreachable. So we don't have a lot of time to act. And in the meantime, somebody is fomenting internal dissent and effectively trying to incite a civil war here. And how do we see this playing out? But I want to just spend the last couple of minutes of this opening to talk about, what to do in this situation. How do you pull people back from the brink? How do you get pilots, who are Zionist, but are in a state of panic and hysteria and fear, to walk away from the edge and to come back and to rejoin Israeli society and the people who are protecting this country? Again, and this is a perfect storm at a town where we are about, 8 hour plus 8 weeks, right, of taking care of Iran's nuclear installations and blocking Iran from becoming a nuclear weapons wielding state. And I think the answer is even though they won't come and they won't speak to the right, I think it's very important that we pass very quickly the judicial reform based on some of the compromise proposals that have been put forward by Professor Yuval Bashan, Giora Island, former Justice Minister Daniel Friedman, to use that as a basis for the laws that are going to be passed by the Knesset. And I think that, and making clear, and that they should be making clear that this is not a usurpation of power. This is not a regime change, except in the sense that you're abrogating an oligarchy and you're reinforcing Israel democratic norms across the 3 branches of government in Israel. And past that, we can revisit this later. But then I really believe, and I've been saying this to colleagues and friends, and I think it's time for me to say it here. I mean, I think what we're missing is a speech by Prime Minister Netanyahu, where he speaks to the people of Israel and anybody else who wants to listen. And he brings us together by reminding us of what Zionism is and how all of us have played a role in building this country and how sacred it is to everybody across the political spectrum and the sociological spectrum. And why it is that this judicial reform came about. It came about because the judiciary has seized the powers of the representatives of this people, and it has hurt community after community in this country through its usurpation of power. It's hurt the denizens of South Tel Aviv, the working class neighborhoods of Tel Aviv that have been overwhelmed by violent criminal, often illegal aliens from Africa who have trespassed our border and transformed their communities into urban crime zones, and the Supreme Court has sided with them against the citizens of Israel. It has trounced the rights of the disabled. It has trounced the rights of the Ethiopian community. It has trounced the rights of the ultra-Orthodox, of the religious Zionists. It has trounced the rights of Arab Israelis. All of these different groups have been harmed. It has trounced the rights of Israeli businesses by seizing the power to interpret contracts, making Israel ranked below South Sudan and Saudi Arabia in terms of the security that people can have when they sign deals with Israeli companies, that their contracts are going to be respected by the courts in Israel. They have undermined our ability to develop our national resources. We were one vote away from the Supreme Court blocking Israel from developing our natural gas deposits in the East Mediterranean. All of these things are actions that the Supreme Court has taken because there haven't been any limits placed on their power. And Netanyahu has to give a speech and explain why this has become necessary and explain what it does. And then he has to rally the people together again, based on our common Zionist heritage, our Jewish heritage, and our belief and attachment to this country. And he has to rally us for what lays ahead. Lays ahead not in the distant future, but now, which is our need to contend with in a military fashion through military means, Iran's efforts to become a nuclear power. And, there are 99 ways to skin a cat, and there are 99 ways to achieve this aim. But we have to use all 99 of them now in the coming weeks, because otherwise we're going to face all of this, and it's going to get worse. It's going to get worse inside, and it's going to get worse outside. As a riven people, we're not going to have the ability to contend with this. So I think time is of the essence. We are indeed all brothers. We're angry at each other, but that doesn't mean that we're not part of the same people and family, and that we have both a common past, a common present, and a common future. And that's the job of the Prime Minister, to stand up and explain this to the Israeli people. I think we have to, again, pass a compromise, bring in as many people as we can, and then the Prime Minister has to speak to the Israeli people about why this is important and why we're doing it together.